Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Alphonse from the ITDP communications team. We're just waiting for one more member of our team to join, and then we will get started. But I just want to say welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this Twitter Space conversation today around the topic of building more resilient and stronger economies around cycling and cycling infrastructure. Just a few housekeeping things. You can raise your hand using the little emoji button at the bottom of your screen if you're a listener, if you haven't used a Twitter Space before. And we'll take questions a little bit later on after we kind of get the ball rolling and have everyone answer some questions. And you can also tweet questions at ITDP underscore HQ. And we'll be taking a look at them and then choosing a few to answer for our speakers in a bit. But we're very excited to have a number of great speakers and experts in the cycling and transportation and planning worlds join us today. And they're all from all over the world, and we'll give them a chance to share their perspectives and some of their ideas and the great work that their organizations are all doing. So I'll just start by letting everyone go around and just say their names, titles, and organizations. I'll start with Dana, who's on our global team.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. My name's Dana Yanocha. I am a research manager with ITDP. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I primarily oversee our cycling research at the global level, and I also manage our Cycling Cities campaign.
Elizabeth?
Hi, good morning. Great to be with you all today. My name is Elizabeth Adams. I am the Senior Director for Advocacy and Organizing at Transportation Alternatives. Transportation Alternatives is based in New York City, and we've been working for almost 50 years now to make New York more bikeable, walkable, livable, and accessible for all New Yorkers. Great to be here.
Thank you. Kirsten?
Hi, everyone. My name is Kirsten Wilkins. I'm the Managing Director of Open Streets Cape Town. We are based here in Cape Town, and we're an organization that looks to bring together government and civil society around how streets are perceived and used. For the most part, in the last 10 years, we've pioneered car-free open streets days across sub-Saharan Africa, but we also work on policy development and advocacy on specific issues, including long-term transport planning strategies. By profession, I'm an urban designer, but also very strong sort of proponent for active citizenry and for everyone getting involved. So yeah, that's me. Thanks.
Thank you. Jill?
Hi, everyone. Delighted to be here today. My name is Jill Warren. I'm the CEO of the European Cyclists Federation. We're based in Brussels. We're the umbrella organization for cycling advocacy associations for civil society throughout Europe. And our mission is to promote cycling as a sustainable and healthy means of transport and leisure. And we focus primarily on Europe, but some of our advocacy is also global. Thank you.
Thank you. Gonzalo?
Hi, my name is Gonzalo Peon. I'm ITDP Mexico Program Director, and I've been working also on making Mexican cities more friendly to cycling for a long time. So I'm very happy to share with you today.
Great. And Nour?
Hi, everyone. I'm Nour, the Programs Manager at ITDP Africa. I'm based in Cairo, and I also serve as the Egypt's country lead. I'm happy to be with you here today.
Great. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, one of our other speakers that was going to join, Todd Littman from the Victoria Transportation Policy Institute, isn't able to join us today, but we can get started, and I'll pass it on to Dana to kind of give a little bit more context on ITDP's work with cycling economies.
Thanks, Alphonse, and thank you to everyone again for joining today. It's great to be in this sort of virtual space with you all. So I'm just going to kick things off with a really quick overview of ITDP's Cycling Cities campaign and some of the work that we've been doing as part of the campaign related to understanding the economic benefits of cycling. So the Cycling Cities campaign is a global campaign. We launched it last year at the COP climate conference in Glasgow, which is actually one of our cohort cities. And we've been working since then to really elevate cycling as a serious climate and transportation solution. And this aligns with our work, ITDP's work around the world related to cycling and infrastructure implementation, but also aligns with our work to support more compact cities. We know that this type of development really helps to enable short trips by bike, and coupled with other strategies like vehicle electrification, these efforts can really help to meet our climate goals. So we're working with a cohort of 28 cities as part of the campaign, mostly from the Global South. And the idea is that these cities are serving as regional models by piloting projects and sharing best practices that can then be replicated by other cities in their regions or other cities with similar characteristics around the world. And then we're working with many, many more cities outside of that group of 28, which have signed our Cycling Cities Pledge and really committed to improving cycling in their own cities. And we encourage, if you haven't taken a look at the Cycling Cities Pledge, we encourage you to do so. It's available on our website at cyclingcities.itdp.org, and you can click on Pledge at the top. So this year, we're really focusing on 3 key work areas. The first being implementing, designing, planning protected cycle lane infrastructure in our 28 cohort cities, and really working with those cities to think about these infrastructure projects as part of a larger network that serves people. So our goal for the campaign is to have 25 million more people living near safe cycle lanes by 2025. And many of our cities are already doing really ambitious work implementing kilometers of cycle lanes towards that goal. The second work area is really focused on changing the narrative around cycling, changing the perception of who uses bicycles and why, and really working to build a stronger culture around cycling. So under this area is our work on gender. We held a Twitter space on World Bicycle Day where we talked a lot about cycling and how women and children and families can be better represented as cyclists. And so we've been doing work in that space. Under this work area, we're also looking at other types of education and awareness building programs like car-free days. A number of our cohort cities like Addis Ababa, Kigali, Jakarta have been really successful at hosting car-free days as a way to really bring people out onto the street and helping them to experience what more space for people really looks like. And I'm excited to hear more about this from Kirsten, who joins us from Open Streets Cape Town today. And then the final work area is around financing and developing a better understanding of the opportunities and strategies for financing cycle infrastructure and cycle programs. And this is, of course, where our work around the economic benefits of cycling comes into play. So we released a report back in June called Making the Economic Case for Cycling. That's available on ITDP's website, itdp.org. And maybe Alphonse can pull a tweet into the space so you can navigate straight to it. And we found a couple of key takeaways that I just want to highlight quickly, but happy to go into more detail as part of the discussion. We found that ultimately that cycling is one of the most affordable transportation modes, both for individuals traveling day to day and for cities. So cycling costs about $3 per 100 kilometers traveled compared to driving, which is about 6 times more expensive per 100 kilometers traveled at about $18. So we know that this can help people better afford to go where they need to go and reduce household spending on transportation. And then looking at cycling affordability at the city level, we know that cycling requires the least expensive infrastructure to build and maintain. And even beyond that, the return on investment for cycle infrastructure is really high. So there's really a massive potential for cost savings from a large shift away from vehicle trips and towards bicycle trips. So those cost savings come from the health sector, they come from reducing greenhouse gas emissions and reducing congestion, among other benefits. And then finally, we found that there's a lot of potential for expanding industries and job creation around cycling, both related to designing and planning cycle infrastructure, but also around using bicycles. So industries like shared micromobility and cycle tourism could really contribute to economic development for countries and cities. So I hope that sort of provides some framing and some jumping off points for our discussion today. And of course, looking forward to hearing from all the other speakers and happy to take questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thanks, Dana. And we'll be pinning kind of tweets you can see on your screen in the space related to resources from all of our different speakers. As we get started in the conversation. We'll just go around to start and have everyone kind of discuss the work that they've been doing at their organization and how it intersects with cycling and building cycling infrastructure and economy specifically. We can start with Gonzalo, who can give us a little bit more perspective on the Mexico City context.
Well, thanks, Alphonse. And I would like also to share experiences in other cities, but I think something that was very important or an interesting milestone was happened during the pandemic of COVID-19, when the Mexico City authorities, with a very strong push from civil society organizations, made the decision to include as confined cycle lane in Insurgentes, one of the longest avenues in Mexico City and one of the most representative one. And this is an avenue with very limited space. And so the fight for space, it's huge. And where the first BRT line in Mexico was done. So it was a very interesting campaign, and what is different from these cycle lanes than others, it was this effort that ITDP participated and other organizations such as Bicitecas and Mexico Climate Initiative, and participated in this idea of making it permanent, but also consulting with business, showing that even now the business sector is starting to see this very interesting effect of cycling infrastructure have in their cities. No? And it's a little bit what Jan Gehl and his teams have said a lot now of people walking, but it also happens in a way with people cycling. You know? When you cycle and smell a coffee shop and you start and buy something. So it's good for the economy and it's good for businesses. And it's not something that the organizations that ITDP are saying, but you have like large or business organizations, like a very large one, it's called Grupo Caluz, that also supported the initiative, but also very small coffee shop owners. So I think this is the first time that a coalition like this formed and had almost no opposition. Of course, timing with the pandemic was great. And I think that that's something quite interesting. But I would like to probably in your interventions to speak a little bit about the hidden costs of car-oriented transportations in cities that cost around almost between 4 and 5% of the GDP in Mexico. And also about who are the cyclists, who are the people that we are benefiting, because it's sometimes said or some people speak about against cycling because of gentrification or issues or other issues, but I think it's to understand the real effects in people. We also need to understand people. So later I would also like to share some interesting results that we had when we conducted a cyclist profile in 5 different cities in Mexico. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Gonzalo. And yeah, we'll hopefully get to those points a little bit later on as well. I'd like to ask Jill to kind of talk a little bit more about her work right now.
Yeah, thanks very much. So in our work, we have some very ambitious goals as part of our 2030 strategy. So we want to see an increase in cycling levels in Europe by 50%. We want cycling to be much safer, with a serious reduction in the rate of cyclists killed or seriously injured on the way to Vision Zero. We want to see strong political support. And for us, that means cycling being prioritized alongside walking, public and shared transport in the mobility mix, and for cycling to be treated as a fully fledged mode of transport on the same level as other modes of transport. We want higher public investment by the end of this decade, much higher. We want that to exceed 15 billion euros in EU funds, alongside what national and local governments should be spending and increasing their spend. And we think that all of this could translate into 100,000 additional kilometers of cycling infrastructure across the continent by 2030. And so the way that we approach this in our work is conducting evidence-based advocacy together with all of our stakeholders and partner organizations. We do research and thought leadership projects like our very widely cited Benefits of Cycling report, which quantifies the benefits in economic terms. So some of the things very similar to what Dana was describing before, everything from the savings in terms of emission savings to health to reduction of pollution, fuel savings, cycling tourism, less sickness absence at the workplace is also something you can separately quantify. The easing of congestion and saving on construction and maintenance costs for road infrastructure when you've got more cycling infrastructure, all these kinds of things. So quantifying and promoting these benefits is really part of our core work. I'd like to zero in on cycling tourism just to give that perspective as well. I think it's fair to say that cycling tourism is probably more developed in Europe than anywhere else, has a longer history, and certainly cities and regions throughout Europe recognize its economic value and importance. And in our report, The Benefits of Cycling, we estimated the economic value of cycling tourism to be 44 billion euros a year. And this estimate dates from before the pandemic, so it could be quite a bit higher now, given the increased demand for active holidays and green tourism, and the increases in cycling levels that we've been able to measure on Eurovelo routes. Many people don't know this, but cycling tourism is significantly more valuable than, let's say, cruise ship tourism. So whereas that's estimated to be 38 billion euros a year, cycling tourism 44 billion, so quite a bit more. But a few words about Eurovelo in case there's people not familiar with it. Eurovelo is a cycle route network which spans 90,000 kilometers in 42 countries. So 17 routes that crisscross the continent. For example, the Eurovelo 15 Rhine cycle route along the Rhine River, the Eurovelo 8 Mediterranean route, the Eurovelo 6, which goes along the Loire Valley and the Danube, or the Eurovelo 13 Iron Curtain Trail along the former Iron Curtain Trail. And so ECF, we centrally coordinate the development and the overall promotion of Eurovelo, and about half the network is currently well developed. And the Eurovelo routes are popular not only with leisure cyclists and cycle tourists, but also with people making local everyday journeys. So, for example, the mayor of Bratislava told me that there's 2 Eurovelo routes around there, the 6 and the 13, and he says that actually they measure that it's about 70% local traffic on these routes, although they're very popular tourist routes. So that's just what I want to zero in now, but very happy to engage in further discussion as we go along. So thank you.
Thanks, Jill. Yeah, I think we think the cycling tourism aspect is super interesting, and in terms of how we could expand that to other cities as well. Obviously, Europe is the hub for it. Kirsten, would you like to just speak a little bit to what you do in Cape Town?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much. I think for our work as Open Streets Cape Town, we're looking at cycling as one component of a suite of mobility choices that we feel are sort of better suited to a more future-proof city, and just give people options and choice. I think in South Africa and Cape Town in particular, for us, access to opportunity and access to choice are one of the very foundational sort of principles of good urbanism. So if people would like to choose to cycle or choose to walk, we start from saying, okay, well, we should make sure that we're advocating to create urban environments where people can make those choices and not choose vehicles either because of the expense of sort of the petrol-based mobility, or the danger of that mobility, or just the financial inaccessibility of that. So really sort of starting at a very principle-based level, we really believe in choice. And so of the two sort of portions of kind of building economies around cycling, as Dana had mentioned in the ITDP report that came out recently, it was so kind of well written in that it outlines industries and groups such as us who work in one portion of kind of developing cycling, which is increasing cycling uptake to replace vehicle trips and the impact that has on streets and urbanism. And of course, the other side, which I think Jill was largely talking about now, which is the supportive industries around promoting cycling. What happens when cycling increases? Are those industries there to support that uptake? So we work very much in the replacing car trips and policy around urban development to ensure that people have those choices. And one of the important things I want to come to and just touch on is open streets days and car free days, and their sort of benefit to the economics of cycling discussion. I think the one aspect I think is a sort of experiential learning for people. A lot of folks have bikes sitting rusting in a garage, and like, hey, I should get out on my bike, and those kind of irregular but fun opportunities to have a bicycle moment make it more likely for people to take up cycling more regularly and reduce car trips because they're sort of normalized to bicycling around more. So that's sort of one aspect of car free days, which are important. But I think something I want to pick up on that Gonzalo mentioned was just the culture around biking. On an open streets day, whether it's the cycling community coming out, or even we found this with the roller skating, rollerblading community, the skateboarding crews. When we're all together in a shared space and we're practicing sharing, if you like, we also have the opportunity to see other people in those communities and to break down that sort of sense of othering that I think takes place in the cycling space. I think in a lot of kind of mobility ways, but we talk about that as contact theory, which is the more you're in contact with people who are not exactly like you, who don't behave like you, but you see that you have something common and shared, and a shared positive experience with, the more likely we are to overcome social divisions. And I think in South Africa that's a huge thing for us, particularly in Cape Town. And I think the way in which we approach the uptake of cycling, the way that we approach shared spaces, adds so much value to us kind of coming together as a society. And I think the economic benefits of that is something that I'd really love to see being immeasurable, not just trips in terms of kilometers or carbon reduction, which are also very important. So with Open Streets Days, we really try and work on both behavior change, the actual uptake of cycling, and then also trying to sort of expose people in really fun and positive shared ways to understanding that, it's all okay that we share streets together. And of course, in the background, then we work really hard to make sure that those policy hooks are in place to challenge decisions that either local or provincial or national government take that might stand in the way of cycling being the best choice. And part of that, I think one of the statistics to sort of share to give some context around Cape Town, which I think is quite important, is that as urbanists we speak about the 40-40-40 rule, which really is that sort of a shocking sort of grounding statistic, which is that 40% of the population of Cape Town spend 40% of their monthly income on transport. Of which cycling, I mean, the cycling mode share here is sort of less than 2%, if I understand correctly. And then the other 40, of course, is 40 kilometers is the average trip distance made by people to and from work combined every day. So cycling, the uptake of cycling and the potential of cycling as a choice to not only reduce spending, but also because it's such a practical way to overcome distance that many people, quite frankly, walk if they don't have the income to pay for fuel-based travel, is a very critical part of what cycling can add to the economy. And I think one of the, I think for me, just giving people the option to cycle is like giving people 40% of their salary back and saying, hey, would you like to spend that on trying kind of less to just survive and maybe more to make choices that would be good for your family and for you to thrive more. And I think it's as practical as that for us here in Cape Town, to really try and overcome some of the financial burdens and the sort of the poverty trap that people are in, to give an option that's not as expensive as vehicle-based transport. And then the last thing, which is quite practical as well, I think South Africa and Cape Town in particular we have terrible pedestrian crash fatality numbers, and I do believe that while it's hard, it's in many respects it's harder to create safer spaces for pedestrians over these long distances that people are forced to travel. I think that creating safe, separated from traffic, cycling routes and a connected network really does take people off of roads that are kind of incredibly kind of conflict ridden in terms of collisions, and give people a safer chance to travel without the fear of either injury or fatality. So I think for us it's very practical. I think it's a very having the economic data and that sort of like empirical based evidence to make the case for cycling, I think turns into some very real and life-changing opportunities for people if they can move to cycling. And that's something I'd really like to see for Cape Town, and certainly something that drives our work here at Open Streets. So thanks for giving me a chance to just chat about those things, but I'm looking forward to question time. Thanks.
Thanks, Kirsten. Yes, all super important points. Elizabeth, would you like to go?
Hey, thanks. Yeah. It's great to be here with all of you. And learn from each of you as well. Gonzalo, I feel like also in New York, we have a lot to learn from Mexico City. So really appreciate what you've been sharing about all the work that's happening in different places. Transportation alternatives, our really real main goal is redesigning our streets with people in mind, not just cars, and shifting away from a car-centric infrastructure in our city, in our state. We know that it makes our neighborhoods greener, healthier, and safer for everyone trying to get around. And when we design streets with more protected bike lanes, with pedestrian access, with green space, we're really able to achieve, so many of our goals of community well-being, of addressing the climate crisis, and of better transportation access. With reduced congestion and car space, we have faster buses. It's easier for people to get to work. It's safer bike lanes allow people to really use it as a method that they feel is accessible and safe for them. And it also equals less pollution, things I know we've talked about, and makes our neighborhoods much more active and vibrant. So the work that we do in New York City, we really take a ground-up grassroots approach model to the work, of seeing what needs are in each of our communities and neighborhoods when it comes to better infrastructure for cycling, for pedestrian access, and then really leading campaigns around that. So connecting to citywide policy change and saying, okay, what are the concrete changes that we know that are playing out in our neighborhoods right now? And so I want to speak just a little bit to some of the infrastructure needs. I think that's, always what we go back to because, majority of cyclists, unfortunately, who are killed in our streets are on streets where that are uninvested in neighborhoods where income is below average median income. And so there are communities that have been ignored, that have not been invested in the way that they deserve, or like some of our, or compared to some of our more affluent communities. And this really puts, has a disproportionate impact in our city. And so that is really core to what we talk about when we say it's important that we do culture change and think about how we shift the culture of cycling. It's really about how do we make it more accessible for more people and in a lot more neighborhoods. We also like to say that paint is not infrastructure, and there's a huge range of what type of bike lanes are put in around our city. For too long, there's, we have sharrows or just a line, and unfortunately, it has put far too many New Yorkers' lives at risk, and especially working cyclists. So we do a lot of work with the workers' justice community of Los Deliveristas. In New York City, our delivery workers are over 60,000 New Yorkers. They serve everyone. They got us. They were our frontline workers through the pandemic. They are core to New York, and yet are often at higher rates for crashes and fatalities because are often in in neighborhoods that are not equally invested in. And then I also just wanted to make a point about when we talk about accessibility, about connectivity. And this, I think, is something that's really big for us here in New York, is when we have a really elaborate subway system. We have bus lanes. We have so many modes of transportation, but they're not always connected in the way that they could be, especially for cyclists. And so things like putting bike racks on buses, more bike connections and bike racks at our subway stations, at our rail stations, are ways that we can really make it possible for more people to cycle, to use our public transportation system rather than rely on cars and vehicles. And we're right now in this place of talking about congestion pricing, which multiple other cities around the world have done, and it's really important that we shift away from the acceptance of cars as the default mode of transportation. And the way that we do that is we incentivize other ways. We make it possible for people to cycle. We make it possible for people to have faster buses to get to work, and we have those connected together as the ways that people can really feel like every option is there for them, taking a more is more approach. And then I think lastly, just before passing on, before we get into some more discussion, I just this really is like connected to our larger campaign that we call 25 by 25. Which we launched last year, which is a challenge to New York City to reimagine our streets and to convert 25% of our car space into space for people by 2025. And this, I think really recognizing that in New York City, more than 75% of our public space is devoted to the moving and free storage of vehicles. Even though a minority of New Yorkers own a car, fewer than 1 in 4 drive to work, and the vast majority of us walk, bike, take transit to get to where we need to go. And so there's a real opportunity, a real importance, especially in this moment when, we are deep in the climate crisis, that cities really need to be leading the way to shift our reliance on cars and show what else is possible. If we were to shift 25% off of our current vehicle reliance, we could have 13 central parks. We could have storage for public benches, for public restrooms, for significantly more trees. And those are all things that we know that benefit our communities, that create thriving neighborhoods and supportive neighborhoods, and are really in our long-term economic and public health interests for all of us. And so that's really the approach that we take when we're talking about, the importance of really shifting to better bike infrastructure, to better pedestrian access and public transit. Is it's really recognizing that for far too long we have depended and prioritized a mode of transit that doesn't work for all of us, that doesn't work for the vast majority of us, and that is really putting our environmental and our well-being needs at risk.
Thank you so much. And yeah, as a New Yorker myself, I can definitely see a lot of the issues that you just mentioned, Elizabeth. And finally, we have Nour joining us from Cairo.
Yeah, so from New York to Cairo, in Cairo, cycling is gaining momentum as a cheaper, more efficient, and more sustainable mode of transport for everyday commutes. And just to give you a quick overview about Cairo, we have a population of 20 million, and around 70% of the trips are made by public transport, while 13% are by walking. And that includes cycling, which I guess has a 0.5% there. And of course, by the increase of the fuel prices across the country and across the globe is driving many daily commuters to explore alternative transport options, and cycling was one of them. And for that, the city is one of the cities regionally that is spearheading the implementation of a bike sharing system called Cairo Bike. It's expected to launch by the end of September of this year with a first phase of 250 bikes. And a total fleet of 500 bicycles. Currently, there are four docking stations that have been set up in downtown Cairo, where they are being there as a trial run. The project is an outcome of a partnership between the Cairo Governorate, the UN Habitat, and it's funded by a Swiss foundation called Rosos, with the technical support and supervision by ITDP. We have been included in that study since 2018, where we started looked at the detailed planning of the system, picked the station locations, the sizing, also looked at the demand assessment, the financial analysis, all the way to the contracting of the bike share operator. And complementing that, the city is also constructing 15 kilometers of protected bike lanes. And to support the launch, the governorate will actually start by 2 kilometers of pop-up bike lanes to support the implementation of the Cairo Bike project. Another as part of the launch, and to encourage the participation in the bike sharing system, the city is planning on embarking on an intense campaign where it will focus on the economic, environmental, and physical benefits of cycling. And this also comes through an outcome where we found during the study, where we conducted a survey with prospective bicycle sharing users in central Cairo and interviewed around 350 commuters at main metro stations. We found very interesting outcomes where 60% of the respondents said that they don't feel safe cycling in Cairo, and that was because of lack of proper infrastructure and cultural barriers as well. And when asking if it would be beneficial to implement a bike sharing system, we found that 90% respondents stated that the bike sharing system would be very helpful for getting them around central Cairo. Also, we asked about actions to make it easier to cycle in Cairo, and the two top things that popped out were having bicycle lanes and also bike parking as the most actions to make it easier to cycle. And with that, we also have conducted few focus groups with women to dig more deeply into the cultural barriers that prevent many women from cycling. And it revealed that usually women cycle for leisure or fitness or maybe to run errands. However, they do avoid cycling due to the lack of safe infrastructure and also the public physical and verbal harassment that they would experience. And for that, the Cairo bike sharing system has the potential to expand women's public transport options by providing another accessible mode of transport. And another key to promote the cycling among women, the city has planned to offer bike sharing membership discounts, which they already started talking about it in the news. Also, they are planning to hold educational cycling events that would involve cycling events with also the civil society, and most importantly is involving women in the decision-making process, which has been the case while the full planning of the process, many women has been engaged in that. So that was very an exciting ride for the Cairo bike share, and we're very excited to have it launched by this year. And another project that I would like to talk about that ITDP has been working on is with UNIP is a business case for investing in walking and cycling in the African cities, which is planned to be launched within this year. And for that, we look deeply at the benefits of walking and cycling as efficient and reliable modes with numerous advantages, like including the air quality, that investing in walking and cycling infrastructure is really an important mean of improving road safety as vulnerable road users usually make up the majority of the road fatalities globally, particularly in cities that lack cycling lanes and adequate sidewalks. So, for instance, when looking at the public health, it would be improved in various ways. Like it's commonly known that increasing walking and cycling is often the most practical way to improve public fitness and health. And there was a study that showed that walking just 1 kilometer per day is linked to a almost 4.9% decrease in the likelihood of obesity. Another study in the UK, for instance, found that cycling to work can lower a person's risk of developing cancer by 45%. Then, when looking at the air and noise pollution, we found that this would be significantly also reduced. Like what benefits cities would also benefit the climate. So, a study that was held in 2021 by Brand et al. Showed that a person cycling 1 trip per day more and driving 1 trip per day less for 200 days a year would actually reduce the mobility-related CO2 emissions by about half tons a year, which really represents a great share of the average per capita CO2 emissions that comes out from transport. So it's always the case where people who cycle and walk more are healthier, have fewer sick days, and also higher productivity. Thanks, and over to you, Alphonse.
Thank you, Nour, and thank you, everyone, for those great summaries of your work. I know there are clearly so many different intersectional issues related to building cycling economies, and we just want to start with the questions and make this more of a conversation, and bringing it back to a point that Gonzalo made at the beginning about trying to understand who cyclists really are and why it's important to understand the different types of cyclists as in order to kind of build cycling as a more realistic mode of transport for everyone, which is obviously foundational to realizing the economic benefits of cycling as well. Maybe Gonzalo, Kirsten, and Elizabeth, maybe we can start with you based on your work of just exploring who cyclists are and what the different types of audiences are.
That's great, Alphonse. Thanks. So I think I share some links if someone wants to take a look about the cyclist profile in Mexico. We conducted in 5 cities, and then many other cities have taken this methodology to better understand who are cycling. And it's changed a little bit around city to city, depending on the geography, the size, the economics. But something that's very, very common is the reasons of why people are cycling. So between 22 and 26% in these 5 cities started cycling because it's the cheapest mode they can access their works. And between 34 and 39% in these cities started cycling because it was more convenient and faster than others. So you have around 60% of these very important economic reasons that give you a hint of how, if you improve cycling infrastructure, can really improve these people's lives. And also when you ask these same persons the barriers, and I think this is very similar to what Nour said, that the barriers are mainly related to infrastructure and road safety. So investing in the right infrastructure can really provide access to more people, to more opportunities. And also what these people do, how much they earn. It is very interesting. For instance, like in many cities in Mexico, like half of them that we reviewed, around 12% of the cyclists were construction workers. Sometimes in Mexico, construction workers don't have insurance and have many difficulties to arrive to work and to do their work. So improving cycling infrastructure can even improve a key sector of the economy that employs the most, one of the largest amounts of people, almost in every city and almost in every emerging economy. So that's something very interesting. But also, I think in Mexico, traditionally, we've had many types of works that are related to bicycles. And for instance, in Mérida, 12% of the cyclists that we observed were performing works that are related to bicycles. We have some very particular type of tricycles here in Mexico that are used for selling or transporting goods. And these were this type of bicycles. And this study was made before the explosion of e-commerce and delivery and the different, buying the supermarket with applications and that. But with that, this increase has really changed the pattern of how people travel and the pattern of how people travel in cities, substituting trips made by persons for trips made by goods. So I think it's also very interesting to see what this new, urban culture and new urban group that is emerging of delivery people and their needs and how they feel and make their job easier, because having more cyclists delivering packages can help us to use this pattern to reduce emissions. Because if these new trips are made in traditional modes, that can have an adverse effect. So I think it's also very important to see how the policies and infrastructure that we invest in also consider these new jobs that are increasing very, very, very fast, as we heard in the example from New York. I don't know.
Yeah,
if anyone wants to comment about this.
Yeah, and Elizabeth, in your presentation earlier, you mentioned transportation alternatives work with delivery people, especially. Maybe you can kind of provide context on that as well.
Yeah, thank you. So I think, and as Gonzalo said, we've continued to see a rise in e-bikes, and there's like a rise in leisure e-bikes versus, working cyclists who use e-bikes for work. And so it's I think really important as we're having a conversation about the importance of electrification in bikes and infrastructure around that, that we are really centering folks who have been using this mode for a while to get to work, and that we're really coming from a worker justice standpoint. I think there are also kind of a rise of some of those of like apps of like the 15-minute delivery companies. And so I think any policy or legislation that that localities are looking at, it's really important that there are not incentives to gig workers. There's not incentives to bike dangerous or faster to deliver goods and services. And I think in the environment that we're seeing, we have to start from the place of saying, okay, what do working cyclists need? How do we make sure that there is the safe infrastructure, that there are real protected bike lanes for people to get around, that there are really real protected streets for people to use e-bikes and as delivery workers. But then also we're kind of thinking about the corollary impacts. Bike parking, I think, is really important. Delivery workers have seen their bikes stolen. It's a big issue for folks who invest a lot of money into e-bikes, and so bike parking. There's a company, Unipod, in New York, that has started creating better dedicated bike parking, enclosed, and that I think would really go a long way for everyone, for working cyclists, as well as for people who live in a 6th floor walk up, who or have a hard time finding a space to park their bike. And then I also just want to, speak a little bit to something that was mentioned earlier about gender. And I missed the gender webinar, but I want to go back and listen to it. I think it's really important that we're talking about the intersections of gender here as well when we talk about cycling. In New York City, during the pandemic, we saw a larger rise among women and non-cis men who were turning to cycling as their means to get to work, to move around, as their mode of transit. And we have seen somewhat of a sustained increase there. And again, this goes back to, if we want more people riding bikes, if we want this to be accessible as a mode for a lot more people, we have to think about what the barriers are. You shouldn't have to, feel like you're putting your life at risk to get on a bike. You shouldn't have to feel like you have to, be in a daredevil, right? And so the importance of having safe infrastructure, of intersections, of bike lanes, and what we like to call keep the delayed lights. There's so many safe streets measures that come that make it more possible for people to ride bikes, and e-bikes I think are also important for that. I love using the pedal assist city bikes to get around. I don't show up to work sweaty. That's great. I think all things that make it more possible for people to get on bikes are really, really important. So I think that demystifying and opening up who is a cyclist and who can be a cyclist, and how we provide connections for people in their daily lives are really critical.
That's great. Yeah, and I think it ties well into the work that Kirsten mentioned Open Streets is doing in terms of just making sure that folks feel comfortable in terms of safety, but then also feel like the culture of cycling and walking is encouraged rather than kind of just an add-on. Kirsten, would you like to just talk a little bit more about the audiences you've seen?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the things that we've done as Open Streets, I think in the absence of cycling infrastructure and just really support to safe cycling, is that events and gatherings that we would do outside of car free days really sort of fall under the banner of what we call it social infrastructure, which is if you gather people together to do one thing, and that becomes visible and shared and kind of open to other groups, that then becomes either a really positive memories, as I've mentioned before, but also helps us to establish the need for cycling or uses for cycling that perhaps people weren't aware of before we did a bigger gathering. So that sort of falls under the category of sort of critical mass rides and gatherings where people try and make those sort of statements using people as a sort of temporary kind of occupation and reclamation of space. Interestingly, that sort of methodology does come out as one of the indicators in the Global City Cycling Index, which I thought was great to see. I think people feel like maybe they can't really make a difference to making their city a cycling city, but attending these gatherings and riding together does make quite a big difference. And so one of the things that we try and do is we try and also in the absence of a lot of the sort of the more granular data that I think some of the other speakers have spoken about around who's cycling. I don't know that in Cape Town we really have that sort of level of data gathering, But what we try to do as an organization is to collaborate with and identify sort of like self-organized groups that cycle for particular reasons and work with those groups of people as groups of interest and try as best as we can to get those groups of interest engaged with government as recognized stakeholders, so that when government is developing infrastructure and consulting communities, they're consulting these like thematic communities of cyclists rather than geographic communities of people where there may be very few people cycling in a neighborhood, but one of these sort of thematic communities, if you like, or communities of interest might be cycling through the neighborhood. You can see how there'd be a very different response if government approached a neighborhood and said, do you want cycling lanes? It might be that people in that community don't cycle, but they are a thoroughfare for others. So we try and identify and kind of foreground and work with and host events with these sort of communities that self-organize, and it's quite a range. There's one or two kind of reasons that people gather and cycle together that I do want to point out, which have been quite interesting to us to discover in our work. And one, it does sort of touch on that intersectionality with gender. Is learn to cycle groups. There's been a huge growth in people coming forward to ask to learn how to ride. Like we sort of assume that people just know how to ride, or maybe bikes are a little bit expensive, maybe you can work on like the affordability of bicycles. But actually, particularly in a South African context, learning to ride a bike and as one of my bicycle colleagues pointed out, also learning how to swim, actually a very similar sort of historical context in South Africa, where it's actually quite a privileged position to be, to have had access to a bicycle as a child and to learn how to ride. And so the assumption that people can ride is something that we need to sort of just be cognizant of, and particularly women. In a home, if there was a bicycle for a child, a boy child would normally sort of have access to that, and not necessarily a girl, and depending on the community. So I think that's been something we've been it's been encouraging to see. We've been trying to work with groups that promote learn to cycle classes, helping those groups to access bicycles for their learner cyclists, and then helping those learner cyclists to build that confidence that is required, as Elizabeth said, to in some of these spaces where you do need to have above normal sort of daredevilish attitude to be in traffic. So that's certainly one of those sort of like self-organizing communities that I wanted to mention. And the second community of cyclists, and they're so different. If you sort of looked at this group in a photo, you wouldn't really know why they'd gathered if there wasn't a bicycle in the picture, which is so great. I mean, that sort of this speaks to how wonderful it is when people self-organize. Is the neighborhood watch groups in Cape Town. We have incredibly frightening crime rates, and a lot of the crime in Cape Town is violent crime. The chance of you getting sort of violently attacked and mugged and getting pulled off your bicycle if you ride alone is a real thing, and I don't know that I would ever encourage anyone to ride by themselves as a result. So communities are very kind of front-footed about getting involved in keeping their community safer, and so in order to cover a lot more ground, bicycles is an addition to a neighborhood watch or community safety program run by citizens is critical. So our provincial government actually did a huge bicycle distribution program looking at just supporting those neighborhood watch groups with bicycles so that they could cover more ground and have sort of eyes on, if you like. So that community grouping of people saying, I want my neighbor to be safer, yes, I'll take a bicycle, creates a different way of gathering together to move with bikes. And of course, there's people who will ride bikes on other days of the week where they're not on patrol, and that's a wonderful way to change behavior. But our streets need to also accommodate people keeping community safe. So what does that mean for cycling infrastructure and street lighting? And so I think for us, when we're looking at who's cycling, I think that the important question for Open Streets is, how can we support your gathering of like-mindedness where bicycles play a part? And how can we make sure that you're seen as legitimate stakeholders and a legitimate voice in government, but also in the way that streets are used? And can we help you organize an event to highlight and foreground the amazing work you're doing? Is really the attitude that we take to the question of who is cycling. Thanks, Alphonse.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we'd love to also hear from listeners if anyone has any questions related to what we were talking about in terms of shifting the culture around cycling to encourage more infrastructure and more investment. Yeah, you can raise your hand, and then we can choose someone to ask a question or make a comment. And you raise your hand by using the heart icon at the bottom of your screen. Great. I mean, it doesn't look like anyone has anything pressing at the moment, so we can move on. You can also tweet your questions at ITDP_HQ if you have any later on. But I think one of the interesting things that was coming up with between everyone's comments was related to kind of road safety and feeling safe in general while cycling, and how we kind of foster that kind of behavior, but also attitude on different levels, top down and bottom up. I'd love to hear from Jill a little bit more, given since Europe is so robust with their cycling infrastructure and tourism, especially how the safety component plays in, and especially mitigating the economic cost related to injuries and fatalities.
Yeah. Thanks, Alphonse. I think there's so many different aspects to this. And I think a lot of, getting more cycling is really that idea of how do we convince the decision makers, what are the right arguments there? And I think that, in all of the forums and discussions and everything that we have with policymakers at the EU, at the national, at the city level, there's different things that resonate and different things that come out of that. One of the key places where this happens is our annual VeloCity conference. So I would say that's the premier global conference on cycling planning and advocacy, which takes place every year as our flagship conference. So we just had one in Ljubljana, which Heather Thompson, the CEO of ITDP, spoke at. Went down very well. But when you talk to these decision makers, very often they're looking for solutions that solve problems. So if they have a big problem of congestion in their city, let's say, they may be more amenable to thinking, okay, cycling could be a way to help solve that. If safety has been a very big problem in the city, then they may be looking for ways to address that. And, that may resonate more with them as well. I think that in terms of economic arguments, the fact that when you've got, let's say, pedestrian zones and things like that, those businesses inside those zones actually get more foot traffic and more cyclists, and cyclists will spend on average more money than somebody coming by car somewhere. So that can be a good argument, and it's counterintuitive for a lot of people. You really have to show them. And shopkeepers who would initially very much resist something like that realize later on, actually, no, we don't want to go back to the way it was. This is great. Livability is a good argument. I think every mayor and people, who pour their heart and soul into, working either as a city official or elected official, they want their city to be livable. And, when they can be convinced that cycling is a key component to having a livable city, that can be an argument that resonates with them. A forum like VeloCity is where they can come and hear from their peers about how they, tackled this, how they increased cycling, how they realized the project or the dream that they had for that. And I think that can be really, really inspiring to people. I would also say that, we hear about all these bold and ambitious plans. At EU level, it's the Green Deal and how they're going to achieve that, and all of the derivative instruments. Whether it's the Fit for 55 and the recovery and resilience plans and all of these things. And I think showing them how cycling helps deliver very quickly on, what they've set out to do. That can be really a way to get a seat at the table and have the conversation. Yeah, I mean, those are just some thoughts I've got on that. I think another one is if you are looking at accessibility to opportunity, for example, we know that cycling can increase somebody's range compared to walking by 15 times. So if making it possible to cycle by having the safe cycling infrastructure, by having the access to bikes, if that's something that also needs to be part of the policies, then you also give many more people access to economic opportunity, which then helps the whole economy, not just the individual, but it also creates a more inclusive society, which I think we can all agree is a very good thing. So those are just some thoughts I wanted to share there. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Dana has a hand raised, and I think we have a comment or question from an audience member as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly follow up on that great point that Jill was just making around really understanding what the problems are and then having these different messages that resonate with those with different audiences. I think that's so important. I think it's also really helpful to have these great examples to point to when we're talking to cities and saying, this can really work. Building bike lanes and removing on-street parking doesn't lead to revenue losses for local businesses and things like this. Having the case studies and the data to back that up is just so enormously helpful. So really like gathering a library of these case study cities like Ljubljana and cities that maybe we don't hear about so much, that we can point to and say, they did this really worked. There's support from the government, there's support from the public, and like really showing how that's developed over time, I think is really important too.
Thanks, Dana. Paloma, who's an audience member, did you have a question or? Paloma? I think there might be some technical issues. Gonzalo, you had your hand raised.
Oh yes, just wanted to expand a little bit on the access to opportunities point that Dana and Jill made, and also on the arguments that we need to present to decision makers. So I think on the these are very related, but also what we see a lot with decision makers in different cities is that they often see empty cycle lanes. And this is something that can like speak against what we want. And I think this happens a lot in cities that haven't like decided to invest correctly or decidedly in an area, or do it in the wrong way. So they invest and then they don't see cyclists. So the other argument and information that probably we need to have is not already people that are cycling, but potential cyclists. So to understand this, where they are, the trips that they might do later, and where to start with cycling infrastructure, how to connect the ideal origins and destinations in the cities. I think those are key. And how to explain this to politicians, no? So it's a lot in the type of infrastructure and where and how you put this infrastructure that you will harvest more cyclists or not. So I think we really need to give them solid arguments about these potential cyclists that are around 60% of the population. That's many studies show in the States, and now that one that we did in Guadalajara, it's consistent with that. But the potential cyclists also change a lot if they are women, if they're or men, or their age. and also the type of infrastructure they like. So we need to include these arguments in our discussions with decision makers, because otherwise cities that are more timid or not as decided as others can give a false step, and then we have a backlash, as we've seen in many cities around Mexico. So I think also it's very important to see where the potential cyclists could be and how this is connected to access to opportunities. Thanks.
Thank you. Paloma, are you able to speak now if you had a question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, yes.
Yes, I just wanted to make a comment. I was, last year, I wrote my thesis on cyclists from a township here in Johannesburg who have to ride up to 60 kilometers sometimes. So I thought it was very important to highlight the fact that the difference between the cyclists and then how many of them do it because they need to do it, because they don't have any other mode of transport, and then how like for me in the beginning it was like the fact that a lot of people think, oh, they need a cycle path. When I interview a lot of them, actually they didn't even know what a cycle path was, and then for them they ride in a township outside of Johannesburg called Deeb, and for them the road is like perfect because the road is a big avenue, and then there is no potholes or anything like that. So for them it was just perfect because for them there is other things that are more important, like sanitation or water or sewage, where in the places where they live, and also that most of them, 80% of them, they are immigrants. So I took the idea that a cycle path or infrastructure alone can support them. I don't think is that good, because cycling 60 kilometers per day, I don't think is healthy. There is obviously it's healthy to cycle, but no, it's not healthy to cycle that long distance every day. So yeah, I just wanted to point this out, and I'm actually currently writing a paper on this. So yeah.
Thank you. Do any of our speakers have any thoughts on Paloma's point? Elizabeth, I know you had your hand raised, if that was in response to the earlier question. But thank you, Paloma, for your...
Hey, thanks. And yeah, thank you, Paloma. I wanted to respond to what folks were talking a little bit earlier. First, just in terms of Gonzalo's point of like elected sometimes picking streets that maybe weren't the most responsive to need. I think this goes back to the importance, especially here in New York, of why it's important that elected leaders and officials are really working with communities. The work that we do is really grassroots. We have activists, we have community bases in all 5 boroughs across the city, because people are really seeing where the need for better infrastructure are at a hyper local level. And so like what people are really calling for in their own communities for change. And sometimes we've seen, officials, city officials kind of like identify a location that may not be the biggest need for better bike infrastructure. And so really being able to have folks who are working on the ground, who know these streets intimately, saying, look, this is actually a better solution, or looking at designing, like this is, proposing kind of what best design solutions could be, I think is also really important for change. And then also just in terms of what Jill was saying, I think I also just wanted to connect to open streets as a design solution here, of how we're remaking our streets that can slow down vehicles, that increase foot traffic, that really design safer streets practices. If there's a planter or a food vendor, cars have to slow down, really just by default, without having to really turn to enforcement or having to turn to other response mechanisms. And in New York, we've really seen the scalable model of open streets. In Queens, there's an open street that is over a mile stretch that is now being proposed into a linear park with multiple pedestrian blocks, really filling green space needs in an under-resourced area in Queens. In Brooklyn, we have a couple streets that are open restaurant street that, the whole neighborhood comes out, families get together, restaurants have outdoor seating, really, really providing a lot of well-being or a lot of benefits for businesses, but also just in terms of community well-being. And then also school streets, where, especially for schools and communities that don't have enough outdoor space, that don't have enough green space, you're building new opportunities for space to play, for young people to learn and exercise and get outside. And so really when we're talking about economic well-being in the broadest sense of the term, and really thinking holistically about improving public health in terms of families getting outside and spending time together, and our mental well-being, which we saw just how critical it was during the pandemic. And then again, for safety for working cyclists, and for people to be able to get to work safely. All of that is really tied to a thriving economy. And I think we're now in a place in New York City where we're able to pass a law to make open streets, the program, permanent, because once it's there, people have really seen, oh, this is what I want, this is what we can do, and it's really helping people to think differently. I think people can have challenges around change until it happens, and when we're really able to show what it can be in practice, I think just the possibilities really start to be endless.
Certainly, and I think all of these issues are so interrelated in terms of supporting cycling overall, but then also the economic benefits that we can see from it. And I know the open streets here in New York, I've definitely seen both formal and informal kind of economies pop up, just having that urban accessible public space. Vipul, who's an audience member, did you have a question? Connecting you as a speaker now, but in the meantime, Kirsten, you had your hand raised.
Yes, thanks, Alfonso. I wanted to mention something that I think is really critical from a economic development and opportunity point of view, and that is that the majority of urban spaces that are built for or retrofitted to be cycling friendly and makes ease of bicycle use possible really does serve the disability community. And I really want to point out how important that overlap is, just from the point of view that people who do have mobility of devices that they need to access spaces, it's sort of really interchangeable for me. And there's a huge group of people who could be engaging in kind of economic activity who simply can't because our spaces are inaccessible. And I think cycling and thinking about active mobility and sort of wheels on spaces, we call them, just opens doors for people to be able to access spaces that we can't even really imagine, the ways in which it's going to happen. But just making those adjustments and making places safe to move at slower speeds, with on grade, paving that's on grade, and all of those small tweaks we know make cycling better. It's just hugely beneficial to gather and make our cities more inclusive, and the economic benefits of that. I think there are studies on that, and I don't want to, make it as though people are money generators as a incentive, but I think exclusion is so critical to be aware of. And we can help to make our cities more accessible by promoting cycling plus. And for me, cycling plus in this space is very much cycling plus anyone who needs a mobility device to make their lives easier. We want to promote those wheels on spaces. So I really think it's important for us to think about that. Here in Cape Town, our local government has a really good attitude to that, and they say that everybody at some point will sadly have difficulties moving around, and we never want to have one day where you can't be an active and proud citizen and engage. So yeah, so I just wanted to mention that overlap. It's very important to keep and foreground. Thanks very much.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's also super important to keep in mind. Vipul, if I'm pronouncing your name right, did you have a question?
Yes, Alphonse, thank you. My name is Vipul Patel. I am the Director of Transport. I come from Kenya, from the city of Mombasa. And we've been working with ITDP for the past 4 to 5 years. And our CEO, Heather, has actually come down to Mombasa to see the NMT works that we have done. However, I actually wanted to talk about what Elizabeth and Gonzalo just mentioned. And the common city problems I have personally seen is the infrastructure build and the citizen mentality change that is required. You know, in Africa, there is a stigma. Somebody riding a bicycle or walking on the road is considered a poor person, and the motorists feel they are a nuisance. So that's the first change that needs to be looked in before the other road agencies now decide to change the infrastructure. Other challenge in Africa has been that, for example, in Mombasa, especially we have classification of roads which are shared by different road agencies. And you will find that the main road is covered by an agency like Kenha. The feeder roads are managed by Kura and then some by the county government. And to network this and to create a cycle lanes for each road is a challenge to integrate it to have a continuous lens. So I guess we might have a long way, but ITDP has been focusing on Mombasa for the past 2 years. I'm very happy. We have had a couple of events which have been very successful. The mind frame has been changing, but still people share the road, the cyclists share the road with the motorist, and it has a very high risk of accidents. And I guess over time, maybe when we have a common committee of the road agencies, everybody will have a chance to put in a cycling lane just like the NMT. Thank you, Alphonse.
Thank you so much for providing that perspective. Nour, I know you had a response being, working with ITDP in Africa.
Yeah, thanks, Alphonse, and thanks, Pipul, for your comments. Yeah, I have had the chance to work a bit on the projects happening in Mombasa as well. And from there, I would like to support the point that, yeah, mainly in the African region, we're looking at the cycling in terms of complete street designs and road safety. And I think that would also support the point that Elizabeth was saying about having complete streets. I think it's a key goal to demonstrate the fundamentals of complete street designs. And in some cases, you need to provide like a proof of concept example in order to ensure that policymakers and decision makers are familiar with the concept that you're trying to prove. Like, for instance, that dedicating more street space for cyclists and pedestrians won't impact the traffic flows and make it more complicated, while it would actually smoother the traffic flows and increase the road safety. So sometimes you need to take it a step back in terms of looking at the infrastructure itself and the kind of the road safety that it would achieve. And I think later on, when you start really implementing the more bike lanes in cities, this is where decision makers would start looking at the air quality and the GHG emissions that would be the outcome of having more cycle tracks. Yeah, I just wanted to make a point that I think in most of the cities here, we're still looking on how to move the city towards a more integrated and to have a more sustainable transport network.
Great. Thank you so much. And I know Venu from our India office had a comment or question. I think he is connecting right now. Venu, did you have a comment or question?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I was just building on the point that Vipul mentioned, as well as it's been a great discussion so far. So thanks to all the speakers. It's been insightful. What Vipul and even Paloma mentioned that, and speaking as an urban planner working with a few cities in the Indian context, that on one side, there is a huge population who is dependent on these modes because they don't have an alternative because of income and other reasons. And all of these people, they have aspirations, the stigma that Vipul mentioned as well. They have aspirations to own a bike, own a car, and that's the ladder that they look at. And they don't have the mind space either to think of carbon emissions or why they would stick to the mode. And if given an option, they might consider definitely buying a bike or a car because that's what the social and cultural setting around is. And it's probably the case in most developing countries and in some developed countries in some regions as well. So this is one side of the story. And on the other side, you have users who have already gone up the ladder of sorts and are using private motor vehicles at length. And if you're expecting them to shift towards embracing cycling, like Paloma mentioned earlier, it comes with constraints of having a very seamless network in place that you should be able to cycle to a distance, you should be able to take a public transport, and that takes you to cover the remaining 20 kilometers or so. So you need to overnight have a very seamless network and system in place in the city. And if so, then looking from that user's perspective, that they might consider one morning that I don't need to take my car, I might take it. But as long as that utopian space is reached, a big challenge that has been is that across cities, because of the whole budget constraints and other reasons, works are happening in fragmented stretches. So you have infrastructure that's being created, some improvements that are being created for walking, cycling, public transportation. But at the same time, the challenge remains that it's not the best scenario yet for a mode shift to happen for someone who is entirely using a car to consider that one fine day. It's a seamless approach. Hence, I need to shift towards cycling. I hope I'm packaging my comment well. But where I was getting at is that towards addressing the whole socio-cultural and aspirations setting, like one of the earlier speakers, Elizabeth, mentioned as well, I think communication tools and campaigns and strategies will play a very strong role in many of these cities so that the mindset of people itself can change and they have a reason from deep inside that they have towards embracing. It's the metaphor that I had in mind was like having a lot of gyms in the city. You have gyms and parks where you can go for walking and running, but most people don't do it because the need for physical activity is something that needs to come from within. So just adding a point that communication campaigns and strategies might play a very strong role in cities where infrastructure is still upcoming. Sorry.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think the holistic view of cycling and all the things that need to change. I know this conversation is about building economies, but obviously all of these issues are foundational. Dana, just want to pass it on to you.
Yeah, I think we're coming to the end of our time, so happy to just quickly wrap things up and thank all of our speakers and commenters again. I think this was a really great, useful conversation. I think we've heard from everyone really that these economic benefits and thinking about diversifying economies through cycling really requires a comprehensive approach, right? So we need the infrastructure, we need, a network of protected lanes, open streets, bike parking, bike share, all of these things working together to keep people safe as they're cycling. But we also need to think about access and the social infrastructure that Kirsten mentioned. Really changing the narrative for people, and that looks different in different places depending on who is cycling and why. I think we've heard that cycle friendly streets are economic drivers and do support not only more revenue and spending at local businesses, like Jill was mentioning, but they also facilitate this maybe less quantifiable community building that really helps to expose people to each other and to their communities in a really unique way. And I think that's harder to track, but is a really important impact of more walkable and cyclable communities. And then finally, just kind of in conclusion, we're seeing that healthy, safe, and climate-friendly streets ultimately mean cost savings for cities. We note this in the report, and we see this quantified in other cost benefit analyses. But there's also these really great potential opportunities for diversifying industries and working together to advance this message of economic benefits to continue advocating for people-focused streets. So a lot more to this conversation, I'm sure, and looking forward to following up with our speakers and with our commenters on Twitter and following your work going forward. So thank you all. Alfonso, I'll pass it over to you just to close this out.
Sure. Thank you again for everyone for listening, and of course all of our speakers. And just want to remind everyone to follow our speakers and their organizations on social media to get the latest updates on what they're all doing. And yeah, if you have any questions, I'm sure they'd be happy to respond on social media. And just a reminder that ITDP is also hosting another tourist space later in September focused on people with disabilities and urban access. Thank you again for listening in, and this will be recorded so you can share it out as well via our main account. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.